Hello, Dr. Jones Cathcart here. Let's talk about libertarianism, which is a political theory that has many moral implications. So to get us started, let's ask a question. How much government do we think is legitimate? How much government do we really want? There are obviously different ways of answering this question. The anarchist will say no amount of government is legitimate at all. Libertarians will say, by contrast, we need some government, but we want to have the least amount of government possible. It's sometimes said that libertarians will say the government that governs the least governs the best, or the best government governs the least. By contrast, a socialist or modern-day liberal will argue that we need more government than what the libertarian will allow. We want public schools. We want to have a national endowment for the arts. We want health care for citizens, and so on. And finally, we could also think about a government that has total, absolute, complete control. This is called totalitarianism, and this is what we find in certain countries like present-day North Korea. Now let's take a lesson here from philosopher Robert Nozick, who in 1971 wrote a work called Anarchy, State, and Utopia, in which he argued in favor of a libertarian state. He introduces us to a concept called a distribution. A distribution is a way of arranging goods in a society. So let's start off with something called D1. This would be a distribution such that everybody in the society makes the same amount of money. So if I made $10,000 last year, you did too, and other people did too, regardless of our talents, our effort, our background. And into this, let's introduce Wilt Chamberlain, a famous basketball player. There he's holding up his 100-point game sign. So at the time, he was a very famous basketball player in the 60s and 70s. Now let's imagine that Chamberlain is so popular that when his contract is up, he goes to his team, he goes to the owners, and he says, hey, look, I'll tell you what, I want you to set it up so that every time a person buys a ticket, 25 cents from each of those tickets will go to me. And you can freely advertise this. I don't want to defraud anybody. It's not like I'm taking the money from these consumers. They know when they buy each of these tickets that 25 of those cents are not going to the team, it's not going to the owners, but it's going right to me. And let's assume that this actually happens. Wilt Chamberlain now has, let's say, 1 million people buy 25 cents per ticket. He now has $250,000, and that's a much larger sum than any other people in that society will have. So this creates a new distribution. Let's imagine everybody else is at D1, but Wilt Chamberlain is, he has a spike. He has a lot more money, like another famous person, like a Stephen King or a Bill Gates or a Steve Jobs. So this creates a new distribution. So the question then for a libertarian would be, is it the case that Wilt Chamberlain deserves this money? Well, libertarians will say, well, yes, of course. If anybody deserves the money, it has to be Wilt Chamberlain, and here's why. Each person is his own master. No one is a slave to anybody else. No one has a right to take the labor from somebody else. Consequently, there's no just redistribution of wealth here. If Wilt Chamberlain has a lot more money and somebody else has comparatively little money, and they can't afford to eat, it's not really Wilt Chamberlain's responsibility to feed that person. If, in point of fact, Wilt Chamberlain wants to help other people, and he does it of his own free will, that's fine, but that's charity, that's not taxation, which is a kind of forced charitable giving. Libertarians are also in favor of free markets, what are called laissez-faire economies. So if a person wants to sell their basketball prowess, or they want to sell a car, or they want to sell, I suppose, a body organ like a kidney or what have you, then that should be fine according to the libertarian, as long as that is a freely consensual relationship between people. Self-defense, for the libertarian, is the only justified use of force. So enforcing our will on other people is not really permissible. Libertarians support the harm principle, which is a moral principle that goes back at least as far as John Stuart Mill. The harm principle says that the only legitimate reason we have for limiting a person's freedom is if his behavior will likely injure us, not injure him. In other words, if we want to create a law that says you can't drink and drive, that's fine because that protects us from harm. But if we wanted to create a law that said a person cannot smoke crack in the privacy of their own home and they're not harming anybody else, that's paternalistic. That's not permissible. And libertarians, finally, will also say that we should keep morality out of politics and law. We shouldn't enforce our morals on others. So let's imagine some implications of this, or applications, rather. A company pays someone to wear a t-shirt and other articles of clothing all the time, and the person uses that money for tuition or to go on a holiday. One adult pays another adult for sex. A person sells her kidney online. A person gives money to people who will allow him or her to perform experiments on them. Or a person offers to pay a person to tattoo himself to advertise some product. So maybe somebody gives you $1,000 to take, get a tattoo of Joe Camel, and you advertise Joe Camel on your forehead and so on. In any of these cases, as long as we're dealing with adults who are contracting with other adults to enter these arrangements, libertarians say we've no business telling anybody how they should live their lives. Now let's think about John Hospers, who's an interesting case, not just a professional philosopher, but also he was the Libertarian nominee for president back in the 1970s. Hospers says we can imagine three types of laws existing in a society. We could imagine paternalistic laws, like laws that tell us we can't do drugs because it might harm us, or maybe laws that would tell us, how we should, what we should read, or how we should behave in private, or what clothes we should wear. We can also imagine laws that protect us from the aggression of other people, such as laws barring murder or rape, or laws that will say, enforce contractual relationships. If you loan somebody money and they abscond with the money, it would be nice to be able to point to a law that says they robbed you and therefore you should be able to put them in jail or force them to hand over what's legitimately yours. And we can also imagine laws that require people to help one another, such as in the Wilt Chamberlain case. I said, let's imagine that Wilt Chamberlain has so much money that there are people starving in our society, people who have very little. Laws in number 3 would maybe tax Wilt Chamberlain 90% so that you would be able to give enough money to indigent people so that they would be able to afford a place to live and so on. Now, Hospers, the libertarian, says, obviously, we can't have paternalistic laws. Those are not legitimate because we're our own masters. And we can, certainly, and we definitely will want laws that protect us against the aggression of other people. But again, we don't want to have laws that require us to help one another. Again, libertarians are not saying that we should not be charitable, but they have an issue with the government forcing us to be charitable. They look at it as a form of servitude. Now let's think about this in terms of rights. Oftentimes there's a distinction made between negative rights and positive rights. A negative right is basically a right of non-interference. It tells the government that it has a duty not to do something. Don't take away my freedom of speech. Don't take away my life. Don't take away my right to bear arms. Don't take away my right to have freedom of assembly. But notice in these cases, the government doesn't actually have to give us a computer to practice free speech with. It doesn't have to give us a firearm if we can't afford a firearm. These are rights that essentially tell the government to back off and not interfere with us. And libertarians, by and large, will argue in favor of a very strong, very robust number of constitutionally protected negative rights like that. By contrast, positive rights are entitlement rights. These are rights that basically say somebody has a duty to give us something. So, for example, public education. If public education is a right, then it's clearly a positive right because the government's creating a check, they're building schools, they're buying textbooks, they're paying teachers, and so on. If the government gives us health care, and health care is considered a right, then that would be a positive right. Funding for the National Endowment for the Arts, right, might be a positive right because it confers some kind of benefit on people, right? Now, libertarians will accept positive rights under limited circumstances, but only if they arise from some consensual relationship. As an example, I have insurance through an insurance company. I insure 2 vehicles, and I also insure my house from things like fire and what have you. Now, if it turns out that, I don't know, my car is stolen or my house burns down, and I go to the insurance company, and the insurance company says, well, we're not going to pay you, and they should legitimately pay me because I gave them money in the form of premiums to protect my house with this insurance. If they didn't pay, then in that case, they're actually violating a legal right that I have, in which case I could take them to court. But notice, in a case like that, nobody forced that company to actually ever take on that obligation. They only took on that obligation to me simply because they freely decided to take on that risk. So while libertarians will accept contractual relationships like that, they don't want to have positive rights in the sense of government entitlements. Now, what will libertarians generally allow? Now, not all libertarians necessarily will agree with all of this, but this gives you a general idea. Think about minimal governmental functions. We need to run elections. We need to have some kind of national defense. For a libertarian, this would be an army that would protect us from, say, invasion. It would not be an interventionist form of the military, such as the United States has, as an example, where we will set up army bases in various countries throughout the world, and we will invade other countries, and so on. These kinds of extensive uses of governmental agencies in the form of the military would not be acceptable to a libertarian. But a libertarian could accept that we need to protect ourselves from all enemies, foreign and domestic, that kind of thing. They will also accept a court system to enforce contracts and deal with criminal offenses, things like breach of contract, murder in the case of criminal statutes, rape, kidnapping, and what have you. Also, prisons. I should point out some libertarians argue in favor of having privately owned prisons, but certainly some of them will accept that we need, at the very least, some kind of jail to put criminals in while they're waiting for trial. Now, how do we want to respond to libertarianism? Well, taking, our cue from Michael Sandel, we might say the following. First of all, the libertarian tends to say that if we take something from them in the form of tax dollars, that this is a form of enslavement. But is this really a form of slavery? I mean, after all, in a country like the United States or a country like Canada or the United Kingdom, you could always leave the country, you could always vote for different people and so on. It's quite a stretch to say that you're actually a slave or that you're engaged in some kind of servitude. Another point, the needs of the poor in many cases outweigh other needs. So we do, even in a country as rich as the United States, have extremely impoverished people. We have people living in food deserts, we have people who can't afford medication, And we could argue that those needs, in some cases, should trump or take priority over other ones. The libertarian, of course, would say, tough, if they can't afford to look after themselves, then it's not really their moral responsibility to take care of them. We could also say, to go back to a quote from the 2012 election that President Obama uttered, you didn't build that, which was raised in the context of business owners or wealthy people, right? The idea behind this, I think, is something like, well, it's not the case that individuals, say a person like Bill Gates from Microsoft, or a person like Stephen King, as an example, a famous novelist. It's not the case that those individuals got where they were simply because of their own industry. It's true, a lot of what they got is the result of their hard work, but a lot of what they got was also the result probably of the public school system and from being able to make use of a public road system and being able to use a government subsidized form of currency and credit and so on. So the notion of you didn't build that doesn't suggest that people don't actually build their own things, but that we're not really separate atoms that are kind of separate from everybody else, that to some extent all of us require help from other people. And libertarians oftentimes are criticized for seemingly ignoring the fact that we have these, kind of we have this indebtedness to other people. There is also, fourth point, democratic consent, right? We could vote for a better choice. So it could be the case, to take one example, in terms of taxation, back during the Eisenhower years in the 1950s, the highest upper marginal tax rate in the United States was about, I think, 92, 93%. It's now, I think, somewhere around 40%, 42%, if that. How did that change? Well, it changed not because the government just decided that they wanted to tax people less, but because people voted for different people and they changed the tax policy. So if you don't like the current laws, you could always vote and change them. And finally, it could be unfair that some people are better off than others. It is true that Wilt Chamberlain and Stephen King got where they got through a lot of hard work. On the other hand, though, think about it, most of us will probably never be born with the genetic blessings that would allow us to become an NBA star. Most of us will not be Michael Phelps, who got more gold medals and other medals in the Olympics than any person possible in swimming. It's probably the case that most of us will not be an Albert Einstein. To some extent, you could say it's the luck of the draw that those people had the blessings that they actually had. So you could argue that this is rather capricious. It's arbitrary. Some people are better off than other people, not exclusively or entirely because of their hard work, but just because of their genetics or because of when they were born or because they were born to rich parents as opposed to poor parents and so on. And so many people would argue that this is actually unfair. Thank you.